an absolutely fantastic speaker, Eric Miller. He is the Director of Finance and Administrative Services with the City of Beloit. Eric has been participating in this initiative since the first year, and I think his presentation is just very helpful to kind of give us the view of what is happening in city finances. I think today he might share a little bit about these mill rates that were recently determined. So Eric, would you like to take questions at the end of the presentation?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, so we'll do kind of a mixed strategy of, if you have questions for Eric while he's presenting, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll get those. But we'll also have some Q&A at the very end. Before I hand it over to Eric, I want to remind all of you of next month's presentation. So next month on Wednesday, December 10th, we have the city manager, Jerry Gabrielatos, will be here. He'll be talking about the strategic plan for the city and other topics. If there are burning questions that you would like us to send to Jerry in advance, let me know, I can do that too. But thank you so much for joining us, and please, let's welcome Eric.
Thanks, Laura. So good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you all coming out and spending a little bit of time this afternoon to try to hopefully figure out a little bit about public finance. I recognize a lot of faces in the room. Some of you have seen the majority of this presentation in the past, so there's not a lot changed there, but I've added a few things in here, here and there. So again, as Laura said, my name is Eric Miller. I am the Finance and Administrative Services Director for the City of Beloit. I have been with the city for just over 21 years in total, about 11 and a half years as the Finance Director for the city. I grew up in Ohio and graduated from the University of Toledo. So as a proud member of Ohio, I of course have to be, by birthright, an Ohio State Buckeye fan.
That's a shame.
So I know that sometimes can rub people the wrong way here close to the Madison area. That's okay, I'm an unapologetic fan of my team. So I do see a couple of other allegiances here in the crowd, so we'll just have to deal with that as we go. Now, where it does get a little bit sideways for me growing up in Ohio, my entire family is Cleveland Browns fans, and somehow or another, I became a Dallas Cowboys fan. So that doesn't go very well here either usually, but hey, the Packers have absolutely owned us lately, so I can't really say much about it. In any event, I did graduate from the University of Toledo with a bachelor's degree in business administration with focus in accounting. I do have my CPA, and I have worked in both the private and public sectors. Started out in the healthcare field and both private and public. And then that transitioned, of course, into work here at the city. I oversee 5 divisions within the finance department: accounting, corporate treasury, risk management, finance, and the assessor's office. I always like to talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities as the presentation goes along. But just to kind of touch on them at the beginning, there is something called state-imposed levy limits that we have in the state of Wisconsin, which we tend to have to live by, unfortunately, but that's one of our big challenges that we have in the city. And then another challenge we have is reliance on state aids. We get a lot of state aids, which I'll talk about in more depth later on. And then, of course, an opportunity could possibly be the casino development. So we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So this is my org chart for the city. This has all the 5 divisions within it, with all the people that are within those respective divisions. And I'll just kind of briefly touch on a little bit about what each of those divisions do. First, I'll start out with accounting. We have 5 full-time employees in the accounting department. They're responsible for preparing the utility bills that you get on a monthly basis. They also are in charge of payroll, accounts payable, and then oversee some of the audit, when we get ready for audit, which we are actually in right now. We're doing what's called preliminary audit, which is just some preliminary work that occurs prior to the big audit next year. They also manage the capital asset program and they are in charge of procurement. The assessors division, we have 2 full-time employees, but by statute we have to have an assessor on staff, so we contract that assessor out. We've been doing that for multiple years now through Tyler Tech. They're in charge of listing all the real property. They also are in charge of updating your property record cards. They also manage the board of review and open book processes that a lot of you will get notices on an annual basis indicating what your assessed values are. We went through a reval 2 out of the last 4 years, so many of you received your assessment notices by statute, which indicated any changes within your property value. That comes from the assessors division. The clerk treasurer division is one that you're probably the most interactive with as a resident. This is where we have 5 full-time employees, 1 part-time employee for the 2026 budget. We used to have 6 full-time employees, but we did cut that down to a part-time position next year. They manage all of the council documentation, get the packets ready for the agendas and so forth for the 1st and 3rd Mondays of every month. They're also in charge of all municipal elections, which is where most of you have your interactions with our clerk treasurer's office. And they also are in charge of collecting all of the monies that come in through the city. That comes through the city treasury, which is done with the clerk treasurer's office. You have the accounting side prepares the bills. You have the treasury side that collects the money on the bills. You want to make sure that you have clear separation of duties when you're talking about billing and collecting monies. They also prepare the annual tax bills with help from the county. On the last slide, you saw that the assessors division sends the tax roll to the clerk treasurer's office. The clerk treasurer's office gathers other information, sends it to the county, and that's what then prepares the tax bills that we're actually in the process of doing right now. So that I know you're all excited to see your tax bill come in the mail in the next few weeks. So you're welcome in advance. And then the risk management division. This division has 1 full-time employee. They're in charge of all of the auto liability policies, any of the insurance policies throughout the city, manages the workers' comp program, also manages and investigates all insurance claims against the city. So this is the division that you don't want to have interaction with, whereas the clerk treasurer's office is one that you do. And then finally, finance division, which of course is my division. There's 2 FTE there, me being one of them. I have a budget analyst also in the finance division. And we prepare financial statements, help coordinate the audit, as well as issuing and managing debt. I also do and manage the investment portfolio for the city of any excess funds. And then of course, as I mentioned, I oversee the other 5 divisions within the city finance department. Okay, so to the nitty gritty. So this is the most recent adopted levy for the City of Beloit. So you can see here, the total levy is right about $2.5 million or $20.5 million. And this is the breakdown that the City Council then approves for that distribution of the levy. So of the $20.5 million, only $11 million of this levy actually goes to the general fund. The rest of it then gets divvied out between the debt service fund, which is then used to pay off all the outstanding general obligation debt along with its taxes, or along with its interest. There's also subsidies within the levy that the city then funds, such as our transit unit, and of course where we're at right now, the Beloit Public Library. So those allocations get made on an annual basis according to what the levy indicates. Some of the other numbers on there are local matches to grants that we've applied for, some through the police department, some through what's called MPO, which does local traffic. And then we have a $50,000 subsidy to our golf course that's also on the levy. And then of course that levy generates your tax bill. So sneak peek, spoiler alert for all y'all that are gonna be getting it here in a few weeks. I will note though, this is preliminary, this is not official until we get the rest of the numbers from the state. And what we're waiting on are the ones that are still highlighted in yellow. So what we're seeing here is we take that levy that we just saw on the prior screen, calculate out what's called the local rate. I think I have a point or something. So this details then all of the different taxing jurisdictions that then provide us their levies that they've been passed through their boards. We then calculate out the actual rate based on all of the total assessed values in the city. So it's just a simple division calculation. As I like to say, it's just math, okay? It's just math. You take your total amounts of all the differing board levies, add them all up, divided by the total value of the property located in the city of Beloit, and you have what's called your mill rate. So all of your combined jurisdictions added together make up that total mill rate. So I wanted to include, and I guess what I'll kind of show you here, the top line here is the school district of Beloit, projected mill rate. Then there's a reduction in the state aid line. That's your school levy credit that you see deducted straight from your bill. Then you have the city's local tax rate, the county's rate. There is no state tax rate because there is no state tax levy. Black Hawk Technical College. And then if you're a resident in the city of Beloit but in the Turner School District, this would be the Turner School District's rate. And then if you're in the Clinton School District, that's the Clinton School District rate. So what we do is we just literally add these numbers up and come up with your total mill rate. If you're in the city, under the Beloit School District rate, the Turner rate, and the Clinton rate. We'll also receive what's called lottery credit and first dollar credit. Those are just deductions straight off your tax bill. We haven't received those numbers yet, but when you do, that's some of the things that we're waiting on in order to complete your tax bill. I did want to show just a 3-year history so you can kind of see where we've been in the past couple of years and where we're projecting to be for this year, all payable in 2026. Fairly stable rates when you kind of look at it in its entirety. And again, this doesn't always tell the story. Just because the rate is a certain thing, that doesn't necessarily tell the story, because like I mentioned before, we had 2 revals in the last 4 years. Well, when that happens and your assessed values increase, what it does is it lowers your mill rate. So it doesn't mean you're paying more or less taxes per se. What drives that is what's being levied, okay? That's what's driving the rate. It's what's being levied. So if your levies stay consistent from one year to the next and you have a reval, you're gonna see a lower tax rate. And you're gonna pay basically the exact same amount of taxes. Because all it did was increase your assessed value, decrease your mill rate, you end up paying the same amount of taxes. That's generally how that works.
Excuse me,
Yes, sir.
when we look at the lottery credit,
Yep.
can you explain why smaller areas are much more substantial than the city of Beloit?
No, I can't. It's a state, that comes right from the state. I don't know what their exact calculation is on determining what those lottery and first dollar credits are. They report them to us, we pass it through right onto the tax, right onto the tax bill. But I think it has, I think there is some tie to the overall mill rate, because I think when our mill rate, if I had the prior columns on here, when our mill rate was higher, that lottery credit was higher. And I think it comes down in proportion to that, but to the exact calculation, I don't know what that is. Any other questions? Okay, so once we get the tax bills out, the revenue that comes in, I'm gonna focus now kind of on the general fund. The general fund is our main operating fund in the city. We have multiple different funds, but this is the main one that encompasses most of our kind of operational type divisions outside of the utilities. And so the revenues then that come in all get added together and come up with a total general fund revenue stream. So when I was mentioning the levy, that's the portion that comes into that number right there. So you can see that that's a relatively small portion of the overall general fund budget. Most of our dollars come right here, and I mentioned it earlier, the state, and federal, and intergovernmental aids. So you're talking 61% of our total general fund revenues come from basically state and federal aids, mostly state aids. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between licenses and permits and departmental permits? What are departmental permits?
I actually have a slide for that later on.
Okay.
And so, but license and permits, so the question was, what's the difference between license and permits and departmental learning? Licenses and permits are, if I'm gonna do, in addition to my bathroom, my kitchen, I'm gonna install something. I come to the city, I run through the community development department, I get issued a permit to improve my property. That'd be the permit. A departmental learning would be if I'm gonna go to a park and rec program, I wanna go to the pool, I wanna go to the ice rink, I wanna go to whatever. I then pay a small user fee for that particular program. That's where departmental earnings comes in. So again, one of the challenges that I mentioned was that reliance upon state aid. And that's because I've got 61% of my overall budget that I really don't have any control over. And that comes from the state. So, which I'm much appreciative of. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the $24.5 million that we get on an annual basis. The problem is that when things get tough on the state side, there's nothing that's necessarily there to protect the locals that they're always going to receive that money. There's no guarantee of it. So that can always be changed. So I'd rather not be reliant on that, but again, I'm not gonna look a gift horse in the mouth. Yes, sir.
So over the last 5 or 10 years,
Yep.
what's been the average of that?
It used to be right around the upper 50s, and then it came down a couple of years ago into the mid 50s. I'm sorry, the question was, what did the state aids used to be over the history of the city? There was legislation passed in 2023 that actually increased the state aid, the shared revenue specifically, that local municipal governments got. And so what it did, and I'll explain a little bit later, but it basically added some shared revenue to local government. So that then boosted that number back up into the above 60 line percentage area. So. But the rest of the entire budget is made up of, other than taxes and intergovernmental aids, which is 91%, the rest of the budget is only 9% from user fees, essentially user fees. Okay, so this is the detail, and this is where I will kind of answer your question a little bit more detail. Of the shared revenue, so shared revenue, what is that? The state has a 5% tax, state tax, sales tax. So you go to the store, spend $100, you end up spending $105 because of the 5% tax. Well, $1 of that $5 ends up going into a pot of money that the state then distributes that to local governments, and that's the state shared revenue. So it's 1% of the 5% state shared state sales tax, or 20% of the overall tax. What that legislation in 2023 did was it then reset that number to say, you know what, we have not had an increase in the state shared revenue in decades. And it's about time that we then pass some of that back along to the local governments. So what they did was they had a campaign that was called Protect the Penny. Okay, so if you think about that, 1%, that's a penny, right? So I'm protecting that penny. I'm going to say we are now going to make sure that we protect that 1 cent so that that goes back to the state or to the local governments. which we're so grateful for. So we did, and it was a very bipartisan legislation that occurred, which is, in today's environment, and frankly any environment, can be a challenge. And so when you're able to pass something on a bipartisan level, that usually benefits us pretty well. So that's what state shared revenue is. We now have that also indexed to inflation, whereas in the past, the biennial state budget would come about. They would have an amount in the budget that would say, this is your amount of shared revenue, and that's what it was going to stay. Well, now what they do is they index that to basically inflation, or what the increase in sales tax revenues are. So if the state sees an increase of 10% in overall sales tax revenues, then shared revenue is also going to see a 10% increase in that. So we're all kind of in it together. We benefit when the state benefits, which is nice to see. General transportation aids. So this is an interesting one. The state gives money back to the locals in a transportation aid. That's the funding source of that is the gas tax. And so what they say is, all right, well, take your 6-year average of how much you've spent on road improvements in your local government, and then we're going to average that out, and then we're going to multiply it by some percentage which ends up being like a percentage of dollars that you've appropriated in the state budget, and that's what you get. So the idea is, if you spend more money, you get more money back. Okay, so it's a spend more, get more kind of a concept, which is okay. Except if you can't afford to spend money on your budgets, then it's not okay. But that's the system. Which then is weird, because then the very next line item is something that it's an incentive called expenditure restraint. So now we then say, don't spend a lot of money, and then we're going to incentivize you by not spending money. And so what they do is they say, well, let's take your net new construction, but I'm not going to give you full credit for your net new construction. You're only going to get 60% of that. And then I'm going to add in the CPIU, which is basically the consumer price index. And then that's what you can increase your general fund budget by. And if you go over that, you're not going to get the incentive. But if you stay under that, you will. So it's this weird balancing act that we have to perform on an annual basis, saying, okay, I want to spend more money because I want to maximize what I get in transportation aid, but I don't want to maximize it too much because I don't want to lose my incentive for my expenditure restraint. So you kind of have this dance that you go around within a budget, and that's just part of it. And then, of course, you have exemption aids. So what that basically is computers used to be taxed under personal property tax. Personal property items used to be taxed under personal property tax. Within the legislation, the last couple of years, they said, we're doing away with personal property. You're no longer going to be taxed on personal property. But finance directors across the state were like, whoa, if you do that, we're going to lose quite a bit of money, quite a bit of revenue here. So they said, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to take the value of all of that property that we just exempted, and we're going to then pay you an amount equivalent to what that would have been. Okay, I mean, that works. That's great. I just got made whole for 1 year, right? Now it's in perpetuity, which is great, until it's not. And then what? But it doesn't account for any additional investment in your community when they did that, which, okay, we can at least live with the break even, right, for a little bit. So in any event, they did that also with computers, and that's called the computer exemption scheme. So taxes is the next largest one. We talked about that. I did mention something called levy limits. And so what the state has done is they said that you can not increase your local levy by more than 0% or what's called net new construction. And so what that means is that if we have new construction in our community, but we had to maybe tear something down in order for us to build whatever we just constructed, you have to reduce that so it becomes a net. It's a net number. You don't get the full value of that new development. You divide that total in your community, divided by your equalized values, you come up with a percentage. That's the amount of increase that you're allowed to increase your base levy by. So as an example, a 1% net new construction in the city of Beloit roughly is the equivalent of about $150,000. That is not very much. Yes?
How does the construction of the casino equate in this story?
So the question was, how does the casino development equate to net new construction for the city? $0. $0.
Is that a TIF zone?
It is not. It is not in a TIF. The reason that it's $0 is because it's on sovereign land that has been put in trusts by the United States government. So it's non-taxed land. So any development that occurs on that land is non-taxable.
So there'll be no hotel motel tax if that's ever developed there as well?
There will be, but there won't. Okay, the question was, would there be any hotel motel tax on that? There would be.
It's no longer sovereign?
It is sovereign, but there would, in the IGA that the city has with the nation, it indicates that those kind of ordinances still apply. Okay, so they would still get water, sewer, stormwater, all of the local ordinances, even though it's on sovereign land. But what it doesn't do is it still has a $0 tax value. So you're not gonna get a property tax on that particular land, but you will get the building permits, code permits, all of your licenses, that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
On road improvements or development, how is it handled between federal, state, county, and local roads? Who has responsibility to what degree on the financing of that?
Yeah, so the question is, who has responsibility for the road maintenance, I assuming what you're indicating?
And or improvement or
Or
whatever.
improvement on state, local, county, highways, roads, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Local, right? Part of the connecting highway aid, it helps with the state highways. So that's what part of that does. And then if there's an agreement, sometimes we have agreements with neighboring jurisdictions for maintenance on some other type of roads that maybe are shared or kind of border roads, that kind of thing.
And if it's a US road or a federal road,
Then, yeah, if it's like the interstate, then that's the state.
how about, Route 51 going
Yeah,
through
that's
is
included in part of this general transportation aid and connecting aid. So we do get some payments for those, for the maintenance of them.
what percentage or what, how does that work out usually? Hard to figure.
You can't go behind that curtain?
It's usually, I mean, is it 100%? No, it's not 100%. But, yeah, so the local picks up a lot of it. And I think that's why we've seen a lot of, push for infrastructure. How do we fund infrastructure in local governments? And I think that's part of the conversation. Hotel motel tax, so just got brought up. Hotel motel tax, we have an ordinance that levies 8% tax on all stays at hotels and motels in the city of Beloit. That's a pass-through. The city ends up remitting 80% of that to our Convention and Visitors Bureau of Beloit. So that's what helps fund that program, and we keep 20%. And then we have what's called a pilot or a payment in lieu of taxes. What that is the utility, the water utility in the city of Beloit is, since it's owned by the city, it's exempt. And so we're not gonna charge ourselves property taxes on exempt property. So a calculation is made that basically says, here's the value of the utility, and here's what the tax rate would be, and they pay us a portion of what that tax rate is. So it's payment in lieu of tax, that's what that stands for. And then we talk about departmental earnings. That was the question that got brought up earlier. That would be property fees, permits, inspection fees, that kind of thing. Park and rec charges, pool, rotary, those kind of user fees are what your departmental earnings for park and rec. Cash property is interest income, that's the majority of what that means. And then other income traditionally would be fund balance. So the expenditure side, of course, the amount matches. That's what makes it a balanced budget. If you ever hear about, oh, we need to get a balanced budget, well, that means that your expenditures exactly match what your revenues are. Okay, it's a net zero, so you know you've got a balanced budget. Where it might not be balanced, you might see some applications of fund balance to then help offset the revenue side, maybe you might have some additional expenditures. Sometimes that's not all bad. We have a fund balance policy at the city that says when and how we can use our fund balance. So what might I use fund balance for? So we had a project that was just in the budget in 2025 to completely rewrite our code ordinance. Well, that can get expensive. And so what we do is if you have excess funds that are on hand, you apply those because it's a one-time big ticket item that then I'm not going to tax the local residents for in the next budget cycle because we have funds on hand that can pay for it now. So we apply fund balance, and so you might say, well, then that's not a balanced budget. Technically, that's true, but it's intentional. It's not a deficit per se. So that's when you would find reasons why you would apply fund balance. Other big ticket items we've used in the past as well. This is the overall expenditures of the general fund. When you take a look at police and fire combined, that's about 61%. It's almost the exact same number as our state share revenue. There's no correlation, by the way, it's just like coincidence that it's within a couple $100,000 of each other. But in any event, the biggest users or the biggest departments within the general fund are going to be your police and fire departments. That just goes without saying. Public Works is always number 2. So between the two of them, you're looking at about 80% total of your overall general fund. That's a fairly common allocation if you kind of look at other cities across the state. Really not that far off. Overall, the biggest expense, and I'm sure anybody has experience here, personnel, so wages and benefits are going to be your biggest expense pretty much no matter what you do. Personnel expenses make up 80% of our total budget. So you have a very lean overall budget when you're looking at $32 million is personnel related. You only have $8 million that's there for the day-to-day stuff. Keeping the lights on, utilities, and that doesn't even include just normal day supplies type things. So when you look at how, government waste, a lot of spending, that's not really the case right here. That's not the case here. And we do make a very concerted effort when we're going through our budget process. We look at every line item as we're going through a meeting with each department director. Nick Damascus, the public library director here, he can attest to that. We do that. Jennifer. So anyway, that's the breakdown of how the general fund is allocated. Again, this is just a little bit more detail of what might be in those departments. Of course, police and fire are your protective services departments. Streets, parks, snow removal would be your public works. I already talked probably too much about finance and admin. Community development would be your planning, building, housing, that sort of thing. And then general government is kind of your catch-all. That would be your local government, city council, city manager. Yes, sir.
I know the departments changed the public transit. What department does that fall into? I know it changed hands a couple times in the last few years.
Yeah, it changed hands once. It used to be in public works. It's now in community development.
Thank you.
Yep. Transit is its own separate fund though. It's just managed in the community development department. But transit expenses are not included in any of these numbers here, because this is all general fund. Transit is its own, what we call it a utility, but it's not a utility, it's called an enterprise fund, and so it's in its own fund.
Thank you.
Eric?
Yes?
Does the city council set the staffing levels for the police and fire, or is that done by the commissioner? How's that work?
So the question was, the city council set the staffing levels for the public safety departments? Technically, levels, no. Dollars, yes. So staff will recommend what we believe those departments need, and then it's up to council to approve the appropriation of funds to pay for those personnel levels that were set. So the council does not get into the detail on how many officers we have, how many firefighters we have, how many of blank that we have, but they say you have this much money to pay for what those things are. Police and Fire Commission is in charge of the hiring and firing and that kind of thing, but they're not setting necessarily the levels either. Okay, so one of the other big ticket items in terms of the city budget is our capital program. And so those are in, again, separate funds similar to the transit fund. You don't have a lot of capital items that run through your general fund. So we have an entirely separate capital fund, and so we have an entirely separate capital program. And so what we're doing is we're then funding the annual capital program in the capital improvement funds. And so those sources of funds are listed here. The first one being general obligation notes and bonds, and also utility revenue bonds. Some of the other funding sources would be fund balance. We kind of just talked a little bit about fund balance. If there was a project that maybe didn't get done in a prior year, that can roll over into a capital project fund so that you can do it in a subsequent year. That's fund balance. Special assessments, state and federal funds for grants, and then the operating budgets and utilities and other funding. So what do all those funding sources actually do? What do they fund? They fund infrastructure, building, capital equipment, development, redevelopment properties, and then of course financing costs when we actually issue debt. So what is general obligation debt? So what that means is that anything that we borrow under the GO, or general obligation debt, means that that's backed by the full faith and credit of the properties located in the city of Beloit. So you are responsible, if you're a property owner, to then pay for the debt that is outstanding that the city has issued. Now that was one thing that the levy limits actually did address that was pretty smart. They said, we are not going to allow local governments to not be able to pay their bills. Because you might say, well, how am I going to increase my debt? How am I going to pay for this stuff if you're telling me that I can't increase my levy by more than, say, 1% in that new construction? Well, they said, well, that's exactly right. You can exempt anything related to GO debt in your levy limit. So they make sure 100% you have the ability to levy what you owe, because the last thing that the state wants is a bunch of local governments going bankrupt because they can't pay their bills. And that would not be a good look. So that is exempt. So that's what GO debt means. Utility revenue bonds are done a little bit differently. Those are paid for by the user fees of that utility exclusively. So if the water utility, or I'll use the example, the wastewater treatment plant just did an upgrade project, it's just finishing up right now. That's being paid for by the user fees of the utility. It's not being paid for through the levy. So it's not a general obligation. So that's why we then might increase some of your wastewater rates on an annual basis to help pay for that wastewater treatment plant project. It's the same thing we've done for the utility, the water utility when we purchased the utility, and it's when we've done upgrades at the water utility as well. Those are revenue bonds. And so a lot of talk has been, lately, certain capital needs that the city might have. I think the main one being the police department or the police station. A lot of discussion really over the last few years about the need for the police station and how might that be funded. Well, it can be funded in a few different ways or a few different sources. It doesn't all have to come from one or the other. But the main one would be, at least in my projection at this point, would be through general obligation debt. You'd have to borrow that kind of money in order to fund the police station. You might be, the next thing that might be would be state and federal funds, grants. So we're constantly then looking for, and working with legislators, is there anything in the state budget that we could possibly use to help offset costs for the police station? Those have been discussions that have been had. There's also been discussions on the federal side with our federal senators, or state senators. Is there anything in the federal budget that could possibly be earmarked to help offset these programs? So we're constantly looking at ways to mitigate the overall impact of what that station would look like by, instead of just saying, you know what, it's fine, debt's exempt from the levy limits, we're just gonna borrow whatever it is we wanna borrow, and we're just gonna throw it on the tax levy. That's not really the way that we operate. That's not my MO for sure. So I wanna try and make sure that we're taking advantage of every other funding source possible to get those big ticket items paid for outside of geo debt. Some of the other examples of what you might use for funding sources would be the sidewalk replacement or water sewer extensions. Those would be special assessments. You would have state and federal grants, transit buses, possibly the Wood Family Bridge was one that's just recently been talked about. We just went to council a couple of weeks ago and got an approval from council to apply for a federal or a state grant that would help to offset the cost of repairing that bridge. But that's another example of a different type, which would be a public-private partnership, because then you could reach out to the local community who might have a vested interest in that particular item, and then you can partner with the community, private entities. And so you're then offsetting those costs using private dollars along with some public dollars as well. So there's a lot of different ways to fund the capital programs that we have in the city. It's extensive, I didn't put them all here, but it kind of gives you an idea of what those things are being used for within the capital program. Yes.
Yeah, question. What's the city's current credit rating, and what kind of percentage are you able to borrow at roughly at this time?
So the question is, what is our credit rate, what's the city's credit rating? And then what is the percent that we can actually borrow if we needed to? So we are currently a AA- credit rating, which is actually really good. So we were upgraded probably 6 years ago now. I think we went from A+ to a AA-. So that's, I'll pat myself on the back, that's exceptional, I'll take it. Now that was a really exciting day. When you get upgraded, that's that's a celebration day. Okay, it's not easy to do. So we're AA- rated for general obligation debt. We rate all of our other debt. So like any utility debt that's outstanding is also rated. I think that's A+. I think our utility rating is A+. So good ratings, which is, and then to your next point, by statute, we can borrow 5% of our equalized values. City has a separate policy that we only want to borrow up to 3% of the statutory limit. So we can borrow 70% of the limit. So that's 3% of the 5%, or 3, what is that? Something like that. 70% I think is what it turns out to be, somewhere around there. Something like that. In any event, we're under. We have capacity, because of the growth in equalized values that we've seen over the last several years, we have the capacity to borrow more. That doesn't mean we should, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so, to that point, on the credit rating, if you start to borrow too much and you get to a level that the credit agencies start to get a little iffy on. And so that could impact your overall credit rating. So again, a balance between what we can do and still maintain that credit rating. Now, why do we want to keep that good credit rating? It has a direct impact on what the interest rates are and what people borrow your borrowing money from. So if I'm a AA minus versus a single A, I have more risk at a single A, so I'm gonna have, because I'm taking on more risk, I now have to pay you more interest because I'm accepting that risk. Okay, so the higher that rating is, or the better that rating is, the lower your interest rate that you're gonna pay.
Right, but what are the interest rates?
Today,
Yeah,
they're higher than they were.
well,
Yeah,
you know,
they're higher than they were,
the
but
truth
still.
will set you free.
But we borrowed in the spring of this year, and it was averaged somewhere around, I think, 2.5%, 3%, which is still really good.
Yes.
Now that's not what the coupons on the bonds were, but that's what the overall true interest cost was. But in any event, we've actually seen interest rates come down, right? The Fed just lowered interest rates at the last meeting. So we are starting to see them come back down, but when they were at their peak. But that was the reason why we didn't do a bond issue in 3 years. So we borrowed in 2022, we bypassed 2023 and 2024 when interest rates were at their peaks, and then we borrowed again in 2025. So if you kind of remember that slide where I showed you what the levy was, and that second line item on there was the $6.5 million of debt service, and it had gone up from 5.8 million. Well, that's because we didn't do a bond issue for 3 years, so we saved a lot of money in interest, and then it just got added up in this year to then have to pay. Because the project still existed, just because we didn't borrow for them, we were kind of using some of our own float to get us by until we were able to actually borrow at a better rate. So, hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
Have you guys gotten bond premium in the past?
Yeah,
Okay. And then do you use that to decrease the total amount of bonding, or do you use it elsewhere?
both.
Okay.
Yeah, both. So the question was, do we use debt premium? Yeah, that's kind of, the market's kind of driving that. Administratively, it's kind of a, I don't know, I don't like it. Just, put your bid out, what you want your bid to be, and don't mess around with all this premium stuff. But what it does is you then you can reduce the overall size of your bond issue with the increase in the premium. And then what you have left over goes into your debt service fund to then be used to offset interest expense in the future. The issue is it drives up the coupon. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but it drives up the coupon on your bonds, so you're paying like a 5% coupon, even though your true interest rate is less than that because they paid you in advance. That's what the premium is. I don't want to get into all of that, but anyway, in a nutshell, yes, we do use premium. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the challenges and opportunities kind of throughout the presentation. This just kind of sums it up. That those reliance on state aids is something that we do want to continue to work on, and how do we do that? How do we mitigate those reliance on state aids? You do that by getting in new development, casino revenue, other kind of development revenue that boosts up your overall levy base so that you can then levy for it on your own, and then you have a little bit more control over that outside of the levy limit. So that's what we're striving to do. And of course, the state-imposed levy limits is always, the big issue. You still always have to kind of deal with that. So even if you, have a bunch of development in 1 year, it's hard to then make sustainable decisions when you know that net new construction maybe won't be there in the following year. We average roughly about 1 to 1.5% of net new construction on an annual basis. It's not much. And that's Not a knock on anybody, it's just, it is what it is. And as your values continue to grow, that's your denominator. That's the denominator that makes that net new construction number. So if you keep growing that denominator, you have to have that much more exponential construction and net new construction to keep the same percentage. That's hard to do when you're basically landlocked. Okay, it's kind of hard to do when you don't have anywhere to go, right? So those are some of the challenges that we continue to face. You know, we get a lot of questions on the way, but it certainly can take more.
How do you plan to address the staffing needs of police and fire when you're adding a casino that's going to require increased service?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, how are we planning for increasing staffing as it relates to the casino? That's a great question. You try to do research on other communities that have casinos and what that has done when casinos came into the area. What kind of call volumes have they seen? Did they increase? Did they stay the same? Who's staffing that call volume? You know, those are all the questions that our fantastic new police chief that's going to be starting on December 1st can certainly take a look at and answer. And I know that she did have some experience in the Oak Park area with casinos, and so I know she's got some good data there. But that's the kind of thing that we're looking at for sure.
But Eric, the city must have made some revenue projections from the casino, didn't they?
We have $0 that are included in expense or revenue in the 2026 budget.
Well, I understand that, but whether it's 26 or 27 or 28 or whatever,
Yep.
to Bill's point,
Yep.
there's gotta be some revenue stream that you have projected when the casino was approved, right?
Yeah, there's an anticipated amount, the amount that's been, you know, publicly published in the paper years ago. I don't rely on any of that. Okay, I'm a very conservative budgeter, so I need to make sure that I've got money in the bank before I spend it, right? So is there an idea of what is supposed to be coming in? Yeah, there is. And you know, how might we use that? But there's nothing that's been set in stone on, you know, how much are we expecting to get, what are we gonna use it on? None of that's really been discussed in great detail at this point. Yeah, yes, sir.
One of your earlier slides showed that 61% of the revenue comes from state and federal sources.
Yep.
How does that compare to other cities in the state of Wisconsin on average, or
Yep.
just in general, maybe? Is it high or low?
Sure. So the question is, what's the average of state and local shared, state and local state and federal aids to other local governments, being ours is, you know, at that 61%. We are higher. We're higher. Now what the average is, I don't know off the top of my head. I just know locally, Rock County, we're the highest in Rock County. We're one of the highest in the state, frankly.
I looked up,
Yep.
to that question, I looked up Madison's, because I was curious, and theirs is 11%
Yeah.
in intergovernmental aid. Yeah.
So, yeah, we're higher. We definitely get a higher allocation of state share revenue for sure. Celestina?
Another casino question.
Yeah.
The anticipated revenue that may come one day off net gaming wins, my question is more so which of those revenue buckets would it go into?
Yeah.
It's not departmental revenue, it's not tax, like what bucket, or will it be its own bucket?
It'll probably be right here, other income. I haven't looked at my chart of accounts to know exactly where it fits in yet, but it doesn't really fit into the, but it could be counted as an intergovernmental aid. I mean, it could be included there. We also kind of tossed around the idea of it being a pilot, kind of a payment in lieu of tax. We've talked about that, but it would either probably be here in another line item in the pilot, or in the other income line item. But it would be in the general fund. Now, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be general fund. It could be allocated to other funds, depending on what the city council wanted to do with it or what staff felt the needs would be there. It'd be a recommendation. Yes, sir.
Are we at 3% for bonds as a percentage of our equalized?
No. The question was, are we at the 3%, the city policy 3%? No, we're not. We're still significantly under that. I think we're close to 1.5% of total.
So how much debt would a 1% increase generate?
Well, we have $3.1 billion of equalized value, so 1% of that would be 32 million? No. 32 million?
So we could build a police station with a 1% increase.
You could, yeah, you could.
We could build
Hockey rink?
a new swimming pool with a.
For $32 million, this is like the what if I win the lottery conversation. Like, what can I do with blank? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we can do. I mean, all kinds of stuff. We have all kinds of needs.
We get $2,000 checks.
Well, no, I don't think I'd do that. I don't think
that floated somewhere.
I don't think I would do it. At least, here, I'm not the guy that's in charge of that, but I would never recommend that. Just let's put it that way. I'll go on record to say that. Yep.
You said that the city also invests money.
Yes.
I assume that that's on a fairly short-term basis to make up excesses that you temporarily would have.
Yep.
How much is that?
So the question is, how are we investing in the investment portfolio to sum it up? We have an investment policy that we follow. The investment policy basically mirrors state statute, which tells you what local governments can and can't invest in. They don't want finance directors that are sitting out there throwing it in a bunch of equity stocks and things like that that are going to fluctuate, in the open market and have the potential of losing your overall principal or your investment. So we invest in federal agency, corporate securities, all with either in the single, the highest or second highest, so AAA or AA rated bonds. We invest in money market funds, so you've got your money market stuff, which would be your short-term liquid type items. That tends to fluctuate with your federal funds rates. When you hear about the Fed lowering and increasing rates, those are what's going to have most of your impact. We can't invest any longer or further out in the curve than 7 years, unless it's with a certain type of security, then you can, and it's all laid out right there in state statute and our investment policy. So everything that we invest in is designed to retain the value of the security. And the second piece to that is we hold everything to maturity. We do not go out and act. I'm not an investment manager, okay? I don't have time to play the market and see if I can sell a bond and gain some premium and buy a bond at its lowest value. I don't have time for that. So I buy it at a coupon, I let it run to maturity because now I'm not subject to the fluctuations of the market, even though the value of that security is either increasing or decreasing based on what the market value tells me that it is. I still am going to get my original investment back with interest. Now, that's been a challenge over the last 5 years. You're dealing with, you had the Great Recession in 2008. Interest rates completely crashed. You couldn't get anything for more than about 25 basis points. It was impossible to find anything. You then had that for a decade. You now then saw interest rates come back just in time for the pandemic to hit, which was great. That made interest rates go right back down, and then we started to climb back up. So it's been challenging to try to buy at the right time. So our investment portfolio has some duds in it, because at the time when 25 basis points was really good, and you might have a percentage, or you might have a 100 basis point investment in there. But then we also have some that are still sitting there at, the upper 4s, low 5s, so all kinds of offsets each year. But very secure, very safe investments.
Okay, so we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Eric. Maybe we can